The Friday Night Drive podcast as we recap week one of the 2024 IHSA football season. I'm Matt Rodewald, as always, with Steve Soucie. What a weekend we got to witness. Quite the lid lifter for the both of us, huh?
Yeah, absolutely. Just it was one of those situations where there were quite a few games that you weren't sure what you were going to get, but especially with the game that ended my weekend, if you would have told me that that's what the score would have been and that's what would have happened, I probably would have laughed at you. So it's always very interesting to start to get some answers to the myriad of questions that we have heading into the Illinois high school football season. And it was certainly a fun week to be had.
Yeah, we're going to get a chunk of this podcast discussing the Flyers, the High Flyers, and what they did to Loyola. But let's take a total look at the weekend, because week one's always fun because you have the occasional Thursday night kind of appetizer, and we got a good one with Mount Carmel. It feels like forever ago now. And then a great Friday night slate, a Saturday night or Saturday afternoon and night slate that did not disappoint with Batavia and Glenbard West, followed by East St. Louis. Just how much fun was it? And you were at plenty of games. What were the crowds look like to you?
Pretty solid. I mean, I guess the Saturday night one was a little bit less than I thought it would be. But other than that, everywhere I went seemed to have healthy and ready to watch some football fans.
And you got your first taste of Mount Carmel's facility. I will have to do that too, because it's still on my list. I have not been there. So looking forward to it, especially after your rave reviews of what it looked like for you on Thursday night. East St. Louis with a dominant performance of Loyola at Hancock Stadium. They start the season there. They want to end the season there. And Soucie, I tell you what, that performance left me no doubt that they'll be playing Thanksgiving weekend.
Well, it certainly looked like it. I mean, when you went through watching that game, and especially when you consider the opponent on the other side, that is an incredibly talented football team. And to be honest with you, I didn't know what we were going to get coming out of the Flyers. They had lost some key pieces, some guys that had been there for a really long time, and you'd gotten kind of used to having them around. I didn't know what we were going to get from their quarterback play. And in reality, it turned out that young man, Kendall Vinder, played a really nice game, just in the sense of, hey, if you're going to give me this, I'm going to take it. He didn't try to do too much and allowed the athletes that they have on the outside, just get them the ball and let them do the work. I mean, it seemed like a really simple, fundamental game plan. But I guess you're kind of used to East St. Louis, these big, flashy, over-the-top plays. And they got one of those in the first half. They took the top off the defense for about an 80-yard touchdown score. But for the most part, it was a very patient and disciplined East St. Louis offensive attack that, not to say that they haven't been capable of doing this before, but it really just looked like they were ready for whatever Loyola planned to throw at them. And Loyola seemed tentative, and I understand why they were tentative. You can't really guard those guys really tight because they'll do what they can do. They'll go right past you. So you're kind of in a catch-22 if East St. Louis is willing to take the short stuff, and they were on Saturday night.
And there's a comfortability with this Flyers team. Again, the last time they were on that field, they got dominated by Cary Grove, and they had to sit with that, knowing that their first game would be right back on that field. And I would imagine that those young guys, especially that youth that was up front a year ago, those sophomores, they're now juniors. And I imagine that there was a feeling of we're on a mission to prove ourselves from what we did last year or what was done to us in the title game then. Did you get that sense from that defense for sure? I mean, I know there's a lot of speed, but I would imagine there's probably a mission aspect to this too.
Well, the one thing about it that was notable about the defense, I knew the secondary would be good, but both of the defensive ends for East St. Louis were just blowing up everything. Like, it didn't matter what side of the field Loyola ran to. It just seemed like there was an East St. Louis defender waiting to take that play apart, and they did it all night long. They didn't miss any assignments. They were just clean as day. And the other thing that kind of stood out to me, I don't want to say that I feel like East St. Louis has been tentative because what has happened to them in state finals in the past, but it felt like a little bit of that old school East St. Louis swagger was back again.
Yeah.
It felt like they were playing with a level of confidence that maybe they haven't the last couple of times that they've gone into those state championship games. It just kind of felt like that. It felt like there were, one of East St. Louis's guys that played really well, Christopher Bennett, can't be any more than 5'7", but he plays like he's about 6'8". I mean, he just plays with a confidence that you've gotten to know from kind of past East St. Louis teams that knew they were good, believed they were good, and looked forward to showing you how good they are.
So they're going to be in Class 6A, and what teams probably took notice the most? Maybe one of them being the one I saw Friday night in Cary Grove, because if they have any visions of doing what they did last year, that the alteration of that probably was definitely noticeable Saturday night.
Well, I would imagine that's definitely true in terms of who's keeping an eye out, but I think there's a lot of raised eyebrows no matter what classification you're in. When it really came down to it, because you're looking at Loyola, who had won 19 consecutive games, back-to-back Class A state titles. Their only loss over the past 2 seasons has been one loss to Mount Carmel in Week 9 of 2 years ago. Everybody came in believing that was the best team in the state entering that Saturday night game. That was the common thread. You could make maybe a little bit of an argument, but the basic consensus was it was Loyola. And then we left Saturday night believing that we had seen the number one team, but it was the team on the other side of the sideline.
Is this a good thing for Loyola overall? Because they have not had adversity like that going into week 2 or any week really in a long time.
Well, I wasn't able to complete my little statistical project yet this weekend, but I wanted to look into it. I can't remember the last time Loyola and Mount Carmel were both 0-1 heading into week 2. That I wasn't able to find the correct answer to it. I got to dig further and see if I can drill down and see if it's ever happened, for that matter. So, but yeah, it definitely puts a little bit of an interesting wrinkle on it. And you look at the calendar. I mean, they go to Dushan Field and play Glenbard West next week. I wouldn't want to be the team that has to play Loyola coming off a loss and looking the way that they did in that game against East St. Louis, because that was not the Loyola product that I was accustomed to seeing, and I'm sure they're looking forward to the opportunity to right a whole bunch of those wrongs as soon as possible.
Loyola drops to 0-1, and they'll face Glenbard West also 0-1 because of what Batavia did to them at Dushan Field on Saturday. I believe you were able to get a little bit a look at that one, but either way, Batavia, they have some speed, they have some power, they got a running back, and they have some new weapons out there. They feel a little more balanced than maybe they have been in previous seasons on the offensive side of the football.
Well, it was actually kind of interesting because it's definitely a little bit of a work in progress for Batavia. They have a new quarterback that it seems like Ryan Bowe has been at Batavia for about 5 or 6 years, but he's
really has.
So, I mean, he wasn't there. So they're breaking in a new quarterback, and it seemed like at times they were trying to ease him into the starting varsity quarterback experience. Not exactly the kind of defense that you want to try to ease yourself into with a Glenbard West defense on the other side, but they actually did something that I can't remember the last time Batavia had done. They put most of the offense on their lead running back. I mean, he ended up with 30-plus carries in the game, and just that's something that you're not accustomed to seeing from Batavia. They tend to spread it around, and maybe that's something that will develop over the course of the season. But they really went into workhorse mode, especially in the second half, to make sure that they fended off Glenbard West at the end. They controlled that game most of the way, but Glenbard West just kept hanging around. They had a little bit of alligator blood in that one, but a couple of things really kind of broke it open for them. Quite possibly the best onside kick I've ever seen at the high school level that they recovered. I mean, this was an absolute beauty. I mean, they should use this in instructional videos. Glenbard West muffed a punt inside of their own 10-yard line. So that led directly to a Batavia touchdown, gave at the time Batavia a 2-touchdown lead. But Glenbard West fought back into the game, played well in the second half, got a huge return from Mason Ellens to kind of spark them, but got underneath 2 minutes. They turned the ball over on downs, but they were probably at about the 35-yard line of Batavia trying to go in. But Batavia won the football game, but did it in a little bit different fashion than you're used to from Batavia.
Yeah, you're used to seeing some speed running backs from Batavia when you go literally 20 years back with Batavia, but Nathan Whitwell, kind of a different animal with 179 yards on the ground. I loved your note of him being a 400 sprinter because that's just a different kind of speed. When you get out in the open, he is just not going to relinquish any sort of a gap of defenders chasing him. And that's something that's certainly going to help Batavia's offense. For Glenbard West, they is it me or do they feel younger than they had been in years past going in? And this schedule means they're going to have to grow up quite a bit in these next 2 weeks.
Well, I was looking at, I guess I knew this, but I had kind of forgotten, especially with the Loyola week 2 game coming up next week. They also have Downers Grove North and a very good kind of flying under the radar Lions team in the first 4 weeks of the season. And that, I'll put that schedule. We talked a lot about the Catholic League schedule and how strong that is, but I'll put that Glenbard West schedule up against anybody in the state over the first 4 weeks of the season. And on top of that, there's some landmines later on too. So that is that's a schedule right now that I look at before the season, and I think to myself, that's a 55-point schedule. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, like 50 is a whole heck of a lot of playoff points. 55 is otherworldly. Like maybe 1-2 teams in the state will put up that many playoff points at the end of the day, at the end of 9 weeks. And Glenbard West looks like they have that kind of schedule.
Right. And I know Chad Hetlet is not thinking like this, but I'll just put the scenario out there. What this does is it gives you breathing room. Say for goodness sakes, that youth gets them to 0-4. And then they stumble later, and it's 4-5. All those playoff points put you in the playoffs, I would say pretty much guaranteed at this point of where we've seen the playoff picture the last 2 or 3 years, and then the new public league rules, which we'll talk ad nauseum here in later weeks of the season. But you schedule this kind of schedule to give yourself breathing room. Yes, you want to grow. Yes, you want to win. But if you don't, it's okay because you're learning big games so that when you get down Nazareth style to, go at a Prairie Ridge, well, all of a sudden they've got a problem, and then you're on your way to a state title at 9-5.
Yeah, it's one of those things now that's in play, and it's definitely a situation where, yes, you don't want to play a schedule so difficult that you've beaten yourself down during the regular season, but then again, if you are forced into that situation, you do have to give yourself a little bit of a respite and a little bit of a pause, saying, hey, if we do stack up some losses early in the season, if we can make it to 4, I think we're still going to get in, and I think we're a battle-tested enough team to where even though you might be a 4-5 team and have a very high seed, I mean, one of those top seeds does not want to see you on the other side of that bracket. So it's definitely kind of a little bit of a catch-22, but it might be a situation that in the long run, it prepares a team like Glenbard West pretty well for whatever level of playoff they end up in, whether it be 7 or 8. They're always a bubble team.
Can you imagine 4-5 Glenbard West facing off against a 9-0 Barrington? That would not be. That's the last thing that the Broncos would want to see. Well, we'll get to some of the impressive teams and leagues that we saw. But first off, before we get to the other ones, I want to stay with Batavia because they and the Duquesne did a serious number. They got some late wins with Wheaton North and St. Charles North, but some dominant performances as well. Lake Park got a big win. St. Charles North, of course, getting that exciting win. I didn't have Geneva putting a 63 burger on Larkin. I knew they'd be good, but not 63 points better. What do you make of the Duquesne so far, other than the fact that poor St. Charles East is being Minnesota right now, the only one that didn't win, but still put 40 points on the board?
Yeah, I mean, and they appeared to have played pretty well in that game as well, losing to a Lincoln Way Central team that was a second-round playoff team last year. So not exactly losing to a slouch there, but you mentioned the Geneva situation. They scored 5 touchdowns in the first quarter. I mean, it was their starting quarterback only played a quarter, went 6 for 7 with 4 touchdowns and almost 200 yards passing. So, I mean, Geneva is looking like they are ready to make that next step and get themselves into the conversation as one of the elite teams in the classification that they're in. So, with Geneva and everybody in that conference, and I've talked about this a lot lately, the last couple of years, it feels like every week once we get into the Duquesne conference schedule. There's at least one game that comes down to the wire, maybe goes to overtime. I feel like we're going to have so many of those, and it's just a situation where we have to consider that. I mean, there's teams we're not even talking about. I thought Wheaton Warrenville South had a good debut as well. So, I mean, on top of Wheaton North, topping a Providence team that a lot of people like. Granted, it was a fourth down play in the last second, but eventually you start to make a list here, and you've got 5 or 6 teams that you think are definitely playoff caliber, and the math ain't mathing. If you start really breaking down, some of these teams are going to have to lose some conference games. Like, potentially you could have one of those situations where the conference champion loses 1 game in league play, maybe even loses 2. I mean, that's how deep this conference is, where you got to start figuring out like a 4-way tie or something like that. I mean, I really conceivably could see that. And it's strange for some of those teams that, not necessarily saying that they're going to finish at the bottom, but like Lake Park got a solid win, but they have a mountain to climb just to get to the middle of the pack in that league right now. So it's really, really, the depth there is really, really impressive. And then you've got, someone like Wheaton Warrenville South that maybe has been a little bit back the last couple of years, looking like they want to maybe punch their way into that conversation too. So every week in the Duquesne is going to be crazy. And I think, and for me to say that it's going to be crazier than it's been in the past is really saying something.
And Batavia and Geneva, they have, I would say, moderate opponents this week, with Batavia facing South Elgin. We saw they were 30 points less than Barrington. The Broncos putting 64 on the board. Geneva plays a down Lamont team. And so those two teams could be 5-0 going into their October matchup, which would be the game of the year in the league, you would imagine at this point. But, for those other teams, they're going to have to steal some wins somewhere, like Glenbard North or a Lake Park. I mean, you're going to have to find a way to sneak through. And that's where, if you're a Wheaton North, Wheaton South, you know that you got to do what you got to do to make sure you get in position. St. Charles East is one of those teams. They have Wheaton Academy next week. They lost to them last year. Are the Saints any good? They put 40 on Lincoln Central. They mean they have to win this week against Wheaton Academy, and they probably know it, knowing their schedule. I want to switch over to the Kishwaukee. 6-2 for the Kishwaukee River. How about that? Kind of a new league setup with Sandwich and Plano staying for good. What do you make of the KRC at this point to start things off?
There was a couple of situations there where, I had good expectations for some of these teams in this league, but some of them were kind of forced into games that, like, with teams classifications a couple above them, you never know how those games are going to go, but good victories out of the box. And ultimately, what it came down to is the only 2 that lost were Sandwich, who had a great season last year. Maybe Mantino's turning a corner there. They put up 54 on Sandwich, and Woodstock lost to what I believe to be a very good Rochelle team. But other than that, Johnsburg went up to Wisconsin and claimed a win. Marengo beating Evergreen Park is a solid victory in the grand scheme of things. Plano beating a bigger school in Ottawa. I mean, granted, they just got by them, but that's all that matters. You only got to beat them by 1. So, I mean, I think this is another league where you're going to look at it at the end of the season and see a lot of games in the middle of that pack that could go either way. I mean, Richmond Burton is still your favorite and will continue to be your favorite in that league until someone proves otherwise. But beyond that, it looks like there's going to be a week-to-week dogfight, with 2 or 3 games in that league schedule.
Sandwich, of course, has Wilmington, and the Wildcats have basically told the entire state of Illinois, we'll play anybody at this point, so come on down. We don't care. And then they'll have Plano at Plano, the Warren 34 the following week. And let's give it up for Harvard, the Hornets, 20-game losing streak snapped. They were able to get a win. You like to see that. I mean, we don't want to make fun of it, but man, I tell you what, I played on one of those teams that lost 18 in a row. When you get that win, it's a relief and a feeling that you can play. That confidence surge coming after a win after 20 straight losses is something else, Susan.
Yeah, not only a win, but a convincing win. I mean, they won that game 42-7 over Lisle. So good, strong second half effort for them. I believe it was 14-7 at halftime, and then they came out and took care of business. So yeah, a nice win for them. There were several stories around the state this weekend with teams picking up a win that maybe haven't had one in a while. Yeah. Programs that the expectation was they might have some trouble. So it was kind of a good weekend for those types of schools. Still some other ones out there looking to break through, but But yeah, Harvard was a good story this weekend.
Give it up for the Fenton Bison also. They had a 10-game losing streak snapped on week 1. They're above 500. All right, to the Catholic League we go. We can talk about the Loyolas and Mount Carmels to the cows come home. Dig in there a little bit and some of the mess and the muck of what really stood out to you. We watched Brother Rice and that score come by and go, whoa, okay, there's something there. They got Marist this week, the Pulaski Super Bowl.
You know, I was interested in a couple of things involving the Catholic League this week. I expected Brother Rice to take care of business in the fashion that they did. Phillips is not quite where the program has been in previous seasons. So I thought Brother Rice would come out and take care of business, maybe not in the grand fashion that they did. So that was a win for them in a lot of ways. But Marist this weekend was kind of a little bit of a wild card for me. He had a very interesting first week game with Morgan Park, a team that has a lot of talent, has had some playoff success. I really didn't know what we were going to get in Mike Fitzgerald's first game over there after coming over from York. But a good solid effort from that team, knocking off Morgan Park, puts them in a situation now in week 2 where they have this Brother Rice game. All of these games, all of these non-conference games are so pivotal for every Chicago Catholic League team, because you look at Marist in the orange, they're joined with Joliet Catholic, Providence, Niles, Notre Dame. And on paper, you look at that, none of those games are a slam dunk win in division.
Nope.
And then not only are they playing Brother Rice in a non-conference game, they've also got another crossover game with another blue team. So this is just a chock full schedule. Marist would love to get to 2-0 here. That would be great for them. Same thing with Brother Rice. Brother Rice has got to maneuver that blue division. They've got to play both Loyola and Mount Carmel in conference games, and a St. Ignatius team that I think put together a nice win over St. Louis University, a pretty solid team, but nothing spectacular there, but hung a whole bunch of points on them and are like, hey guys, we're still here. I mean, Justin Scott may not be here, but we still think we can be a good football team this year. And even though they're in the blue, for them, they have another situation this week. They have to go to Fenwick and try to get to 2-0 themselves for the same reason that everybody else needs to get to 2-0 in the Catholic League if they can, because once they get into divisional play, all bets are off.
2 teams in the Catholic League that I wonder about your thoughts on, just from what we see in the results, Nazareth and St. Francis. We were watching those early on Friday night. Did they do what they needed to do to make sure that they're in position, and what do they need to get better at in what you were watching?
Well, Nazareth and Kankakee have developed kind of a pretty interesting little rivalry over the past.
Yeah, it really is.
This is the 3rd year of that series. You go back 2 years, it was that wild Kankakee wins it 2-0. And of course, we started this game with a safety for Kankakee. So it was an eyebrow raise there, but Nazareth did a really nice job. What they didn't do in last year's game when they lost to Kankakee, I went to that game. They got down and they didn't really make a lot of adjustments. They kept trying to do the same things that had not been working. And it appears that they got over that, because Logan Malachek threw an interception late in the game that gave Kankakee a lead with about 9 minutes to play, bounced back nicely, came back out, and just didn't back down from it, went on the attack. He's a really good dual run-pass quarterback threat, and he guided them past Kankakee this time. So it was one of those situations where I think Nazareth's going to have a lot of games like this. I think they're a very talented team, but in terms of their schedule, I think they're going to have a lot of opponents that give them their best shot. But even though they are by classification, they are a 5A team, they have a smaller roster than a lot of their opponents that they play. Yeah. So a lot of their guys are asked to at least contribute both ways and sometimes. And sometimes if Nazareth is a close game, you can see them maybe in the 3rd and 4th quarter, they might be a little low in the gas tank. So but their schedule is such a beast. It'll be interesting now, because you mentioned St. Francis, who it took a little while to get past Kenwood this week. Well, Naz is playing Kenwood this week. So we'll have a pretty good measuring scale for like where those 2 teams compare. I mean, they're in the same division. They will play later in the year. But that's very interesting. It looked like St. Francis gave up some big plays. So that's something that they're going to have to adjust and try to, hem that down a little bit. But yes, it's a very interesting situation in that conference, because in the green you've got four teams that I think are all teams that fully expect to be in the playoff dance, and all four of them are going to have a climb just to get into that conversation. It's not about whether or not, we expect to be a quarterfinalist or a semifinalist. Can we get in this schedule is the first concern. I mean, you look at St. Rita and IC Catholic, who are the other two members of that division. I mean, if it's a traditional stacking, one of those teams is going to lose 3 conference games.
Yep.
So maybe it's not. Maybe you got 2 2-1s and 2 1-2s, but that's still 2 losses. And you've got a crossover against the Blue that you have to deal with, and other difficult games. So it's really, like I said, both of those teams, St. Francis and Nazareth, they would really, really, really love to get to 2-0 this week, because that would be a great situation for them moving forward, because it basically means, like we were talking about before, these teams honestly may only need to get to 4. So that gives them a nice blanket to go into that part of the season, knowing that if we go 500 the rest of the way, we're totally good.
Yeah.
If we're a game under 500, we're still in. And then, if the worst comes to worst, we only need to get 2 more.
Yeah, you don't want to deal with the 4 and 5, but it changes the way you feel and you approach things, and the panic attacks, so to speak. I remember certain teams, you get to 0 and 3, and it's, oh my gosh, we're in big trouble. That doesn't you don't have that feeling with some of the bigger classes that have schedules like this for this reason now. So it'll be interesting to watch that as we go forward. One more conference to bring up. We'll switch gears here and kind of talk about some of the surprises. The Mid-Suburban League West is 1 play away from being 5-1 after this first opening week, after they had a big wins with Barrington, but Schaumburg got a win, Friend with a 31-0 win as well. What do you make of the Mid-Suburban West? Quite possibly the toughest conference that we're not talking about.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing that raised my eyebrows was that Friend win over Lake Zurich. That's a program that, has reached semifinals in 6A, 7A very recently. And for them to be dominated by a team that is coming off of back-to-back 3 and 6 seasons, definitely a big surprise in my eyes in regards to, I was basically making sure that was right. That was one of those scores that I felt like I had to double check just to make sure, because sometimes you get a bad score out there and you're never sure of it.
Yep.
But it's definitely one of those games that stood out to me. Schaumburg was one that I didn't even notice until very late in my score collection game on Friday night, and that's a really impressive win for a program that has kind of struggled in that division over the last couple of years. Antioch just doesn't lose regular season games. It feels like almost every year they're coming out of the regular season at 9-0 or at worst 8-1. It feels like almost every single year. So that was, that's a really, really big win in the grand scheme of things. Not only, I mean, it's kind of double layered, because it's like, I mean, winning that is really important for Schaumburg based on how deep this division is, just in the quest to get to the win total. But, having an Antioch on your schedule who is more likely going to go back to their conference and probably do what they always do, you're still going to get 7 or 8 points out of them, most likely. So that's a big deal when it comes down to moving around later in the year, if maybe they go 500 in conference. And, and did they get themselves into a situation where maybe they're in that 4-win group, or even in the 5-win group, where the fact that they played this schedule, they're going to go ahead of a lot of 5-win teams on the seed chart because of playing games like Antioch, who is going to go back to their schedule and win games.
And when Schaumburg, when Mark Stilling looks at that schedule, he's going to see Elk Grove, Niles North, Niles West, Palatine, and Conant before you get to the Barrington and Friend week 7 and week 8. So Schaumburg has a chance to stack up some wins and to get themselves in position to potentially compete for a conference title. Could they be in that conference conversation? That's a little early. But the fact that they're in that mix just because of one win changes it for them. Hoffman Estates also victorious this weekend. They got a 1-0. And then Palatine lost in that fluke play with St. Charles North. And Riverboat Robert Pomazak going for it with going for 2 with 10 seconds left. So Palatine at 0-1, they're still very good. And so this conference overall, and Barrington just throwing 64 points on the board. Broncos are going to be really hard to beat, but they're going to have quite the test up and down the league this year, which might fare well for them if they want to make a final deep run. They haven't been to the state championship game in a long time, and this might be the one team that could get there.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely one of those situations where you just kind of look at what's going on around, especially with these early games, just kind of getting a feel for what these teams are. When I looked at Barrington early in the year, I wasn't sure exactly how I needed to handle that, and maybe South Elgin might be a little bit down, but still hanging 54 on them in that situation is really impressive. I mean that's a program. South Elgin's a program that's won a lot of football games over the last couple of years, so that's a good showing for them. I'll admit I just whiffed on them in terms of the rankings. I should have been a little bit more cognizant of the Broncos in this situation. But it's an interesting. The fun thing about them is they win that game where South Elgin and they go right into Hersey, which is a team that that lost last week against Warren, but I still believe is a really good football team. So they're going to be chomping at the bit, trying to avoid going to 0-2. That's a really intriguing week 2 matchup right there for me.
Hersey's first loss in the regular season in 2 or 3 years at least. They've been 9-0 the last couple of years. The 55 points from Warren, we did not see that coming. What makes them so special in offense?
Well, Aaron Stewart had a heck of a game on Friday night, and this is a team that when I talk about them, and evidence has bore this out, you start and almost finish your conversation on how good the Warren defense is. Because historically, over the last 5-6 years, they just don't give up any points. They just don't. That's what the team is. So, to see Stewart do what he did, he ran for almost 300 yards in the first half of that game, and then made an early exit just short of 400 yards. So, a really, really impressive effort for them in that game, just showing that not only the defense is something that Warren's going to hang their hat on, but the offense as well.
Very impressed with the 55 points, and again, going to 1-0 for them. Also one of those 8A teams that's on that second tier, waiting to get up to the Loyola and Lincoln Way East. Do you think they get tired of hearing that up there? I don't know how much you've been up to Gurnee to talk to the folks of that program, but I would imagine after years of being in that quarterfinal and then getting bounced out, you get sick of feeling like you're on that second step and wanting to make that next step to try and put themselves in position to get to normal.
Yeah, they got to a final and lost to Lincoln Way East, I believe, 4 years ago. But other than that, they've been close, but not quite at the level. It's hard to be. First of all, it's hard to be at the level that Loyola and Lincoln Way East are at on a yearly basis. But yeah, I'm sure that's annoying that you haven't been able to kind of transition that and get yourself into that upper echelon conversation where it's like everybody starts the conversation in 8A with those two programs and then
every time
then lumps you in with a larger group of teams that isn't quite there. So, right. But, maybe this team does have it. We'll see, but a very impressive statement to start the season.
Of course, they'll go to Maine South in week 2, and you want to talk about a statement game. Maine South is limping into that one after getting toasted by Lincoln Way East. Warren can go in there and do some damage, too, to really set a tone for them with their schedule lightening up after that. So it'll be interesting to see how the Warren Blue Devils do going on the road down in Park Ridge. Couple more minutes with Steve Soucie as we finish up the Friday Night Drive podcast. Things around the state, even the small schools, what jumped out at you from the weekend, and what did you learn about some of the other things outside of the Chicagoland area that we didn't talk about? I'll give you one that's a little bit close to that. Canelan with a really nice win at Washington. They have a nasty schedule. It's kind of out of the Chicagoland region a little bit. Gallup Sycamore was fun. What else did you see?
You mentioned the Canelan win. I thought that was pretty impressive for them to do what they did. I was impressed with Princeton in week 1, yes. Taking care of Newman Central Catholic in the fashion that they did. That's a nice win for them. Metamora's win over Sterling was pretty interesting to me, just in the sense of, I think Sterling didn't have the greatest year last year, got in as one of those 4-win playoff teams. But for Metamora, I think we're starting to see them maybe come back to the age of when Metamora was a thing. I mean, I think we're getting back there. I mean, with Washington, transitioning to a new coaching staff, I think Metamora might be now the standard in the Mid-Illini Conference. That's that's one of those situations. So very interesting in that sense. A couple of other teams that really kind of drew my eye a little bit in week one. Columbia did not have a very good year last year, but they hammered Breeze Mater Dei on Friday.
Yeah.
I thought that was a really interesting game that kind of jumped off the page for me. We touched on it a little bit earlier. I was impressed with what Wheaton Warrenville South did this week with their win over Glenbard South. And those are some of a few of the stories that have developed. And the other one that really jumped out at me from a 1A perspective was Fulton beat Forreston 28-0. And Forreston is typically the only program that can really give Lena Winslow a run
right
in the upstate Illini. So for Fulton to do that to Forreston in that situation maybe bodes that there might be a changing of the guard and who is on the second step in that conference this year. So still Lena's conference until someone proves otherwise, but Fulton with a very impressive win to kick things off.
Circle back to Metamora, now 1-0, of course, 8 wins last year, getting to the second round for Jared Grebner and company. They're interesting in 5A because they have LaSalle Peru at home for their home opener. So they come off that road win to play at home against LaSalle Peru, and then they go to Washington. So right away, they're going to figure out how good they really are. Morton after that. Pekin had a nice win, more so because there's a lot of hype surrounding the other team that was coming in there with Robbie Gold being the head coach of Rolling Meadows. I thought that was a nice win for them, or in that kind of fashion, dealing with that kind of environment. So the Mid-Illini, some interesting stories for the folks down in Peoria this week. What are you looking forward to the most? Just kind of a preview, a little snippet preview of what's week 2 in store for you right now.
There's a lot of games that I find intriguing just because of what happened. I mean, I look closer to my area here. Morris is playing Joliet West in a game that I think is really an interesting little. Joliet West only regular season loss last year was to Morris. Morris still believes that they have the kind of team right now that can make a pretty deep postseason run. So that's a really fun game for me. I think that's one of those things where Joliet West still trying to prove that they belong in conversations about the best teams in the South Suburbs. And a win over Morris would do a lot for them. You mentioned it a little bit earlier. I'm very interested in that Warren Maine South game because I think Maine South is getting put in the rearview mirror here a little too quick. I mean, they got beat by a really good football team on Friday night, but I don't think you want to bury them. I think they will be heard from. Maybe not as quick as this week, but I don't think they're going to just go away. I don't think they're just going to curl up and give up. I mean, that's still a very talented football team.
Game that jumps off the page, 2 of them that kind of jump off the page. One in a bigger fashion, Lions at Wheaton South. That is going to be a very key playoff game from a playoff points perspective. If you watch the live stream on Friday, we talked a lot about how those playoff points go based on these non-conference matchups and who gets that extra point for it. So it'll be very curious to see how the Tigers and the Lions do in that one, week 2, I should say, at Wheaton South. And up in my area, sneaky one, Dundee Crown is 1-0, by the way. And they get Central Rockets. They could be 2-0 here. And that league is not really dominant. If it's Cary Grove and everyone else, it seems. And so maybe Dundee Crown can get themselves to 5-4, get in the postseason for the first time in a while. They looked good in week 1. So now see if they can carry it over to week 2. Those are the stories that are catching my eye. Steve Soucie, it's been a pleasure. Get ready for week 2. And we will see you next time here on the Friday Night Drive IHSA Football Podcast.